Welcome back to Jack and Rex Tales. The night was the kind of cold that doesn't just chill the skin, it settles into the bones, into the quiet places inside a man where old grief lives. December 24th, Christmas Eve, and in a small apartment on the edge of a tired town in rural Virginia, Jack Thompson sat alone at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched, staring at nothing in particular. The apartment was clean, orderly, the kind of space a military man keeps, everything in its place, nothing wasted, nothing decorative. No Christmas tree, no lights strung along the window, no cards propped on the counter. Just four walls, a dim overhead light, and the low sound of wind pressing against the glass like it wanted in. Jack was 50 years old, broad shoulders, weathered hands, a jaw that had been set against worse things than loneliness. He had served 22 years as a United States Navy SEAL, deployments across 3 continents, missions that would never appear in any public record, losses that would never fully leave him. He had come home from war carrying things that don't show up on medical charts, and somewhere in the years that followed, the failed marriage, the distance from a son who stopped calling, the slow erosion of a life he'd once imagined differently, Jack had learned to live small, quietly, without expecting much from the world. The only thing he hadn't lost was Rex. Rex lay near the front door, a large German shepherd with a dark mahogany and black coat, now touched with gray along the muzzle. He was 9 years old, a former military working dog who had served alongside Jack in 2 deployments before both of them came home and tried to figure out what peacetime felt like. Rex had never fully figured it out either. He still slept lightly, still lifted his head at sounds most dogs ignored, still watched doorways the way soldiers watch corners. But tonight, Rex was watching Jack. That was something the dog did when the silence in the apartment got too heavy. He would simply watch, dark eyes steady, patient, full of something that looked remarkably like understanding. Jack noticed the way he always did and gave the dog a slow nod. "I know," Jack said quietly. "I know." He pushed back from the table, reached for his jacket on the hook by the door, and looked down at Rex. "Come on, let's get some air." The street outside was almost completely still. A few distant windows glowed amber and warm. Families inside, children probably already restless about morning. Jack walked with his hands in his pockets, and Rex moving beside him, their breath rising in small clouds in the freezing air. The town was the kind of place most people pass through without stopping. 2 traffic lights, a hardware store, a diner that closed at 8. But Jack had chosen it deliberately. Small, quiet, easy to disappear into. They had walked perhaps 3 blocks when Rex stopped. Not a gradual slowing, a full, sudden stop, the way he used to stop on patrol when something ahead wasn't right. His ears came forward, his body stiffened. His nose worked the cold air in short, focused pulls. Jack stopped beside him immediately. Old instincts don't retire. "What is it?" he said softly, following Rex's gaze down the alley alongside the small grocery that had already been closed for hours. At first, he saw only shadow and the dark shapes of dumpsters lined against the brick wall. Then his eyes adjusted, and he saw her. A small figure, crouched low beside the nearest dumpster, both hands buried inside a split trash bag, moving with the desperate, practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before. A child, a little girl in a thin jacket that was the wrong weight for this kind of cold, her dark hair loose around her face, her small shoulders trembling, whether from the temperature or from effort or from fear, Jack couldn't yet tell. He stood completely still, In 22 years of service, Jack Thompson had seen things that rewired a man permanently. He had operated in some of the most dangerous environments on Earth. He had held dying men. He had made decisions in seconds that he would spend years reconsidering. None of it, not one moment of any of it, had prepared him for the sight of a child searching through garbage for food on Christmas Eve. Rex made a sound, low, soft, almost inaudible, the sound he used years ago when he detected a survivor in rubble. Not a threat, someone who needed help. Jack moved forward slowly, keeping his voice calm and low. "Hey," he said gently. "Hey, sweetheart. It's okay." The little girl spun around, stumbling backward against the dumpster, her eyes wide with the particular terror of someone who has learned that adult attention usually means danger. She looked at Jack, then at Rex, then back at Jack. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old. "I'm not gonna hurt you," Jack said. He stopped moving and crouched down slowly, bringing himself to her level. "I promise, nobody's gonna hurt you." Rex had not moved forward. He stood just behind Jack's left shoulder, reading the moment the way he always did, waiting. The little girl pressed herself against the dumpster. Her lips were pale. Her hands, Jack could see now, were red and raw from the cold. "What's your name?" Jack asked. A long silence, then barely above a whisper. "Melody." "Melody." Jack said it gently, like the word mattered. "That's a beautiful name. I'm Jack, and that's Rex." He glanced back at the dog. "He's friendly. He's the friendliest one of the two of us, honestly." Something shifted, almost invisibly, in Melody's expression. Not quite trust, but the first hairline crack in fear. Jack looked at her jacket, her bare hands, the thin canvas shoes on her feet. "How long have you been out here, Melody?" She didn't answer, but her chin trembled, and that told him everything. He looked back at Rex and gave a small nod, barely perceptible. Rex understood. He always understood. The dog moved forward slowly, no sudden motion, head low, body language entirely soft and unthreatening, the way he had been trained to approach frightened civilians in the field. He stopped directly in front of Melody and simply sat down. Then he lowered his head, resting his chin gently toward the ground, his dark eyes looking up at her with an expression that needed no translation. "You are safe. I am here. You are safe." Melody stared at him. Her trembling hand came up slowly, hesitated in the air, and then, with the fragile courage of a child who has almost stopped believing in gentleness, she reached out and touched his fur. Rex didn't move. He simply let her. And then Melody began to cry. Not loudly, just small, broken, exhausted sobs. The kind that come from a child who has been holding everything together alone for too long. Rex stayed perfectly still beneath her hand, warm and solid and present, while she cried in the dark on Christmas Eve beside a dumpster in an alley in a town that had not yet noticed she existed. Jack stayed crouched. He didn't rush, he didn't reach for her. He simply stayed close and let Rex do what Rex had always known how to do. When her crying slowed, Jack spoke again, quietly. "When did you last eat something real, Melody?" She wiped her face with her sleeve. "I don't know," she whispered. 2 days, maybe?" Jack closed his eyes for just a moment. Then he opened them and said, in the steadiest voice he had, "Okay, come on, let's get you warm." Inside the apartment, Jack moved with a quiet purposefulness, the kind of efficiency that comes from years of operating under pressure. He started the stove, soup from a can, then eggs, then toast, building something warm and simple and real. He found an old sweatshirt that drowned Melody completely when she pulled it on, and she sat at the kitchen table with her feet tucked up under her, watching Rex, who had positioned himself directly beside her chair. He never moved from that spot. While the food warmed, Jack sat across from her and asked, very gently, about her family. He asked the way he'd been trained to ask frightened people questions, slowly, without pressure, leaving room for silence. Melody told him in pieces. Her grandmother had raised her. Her grandmother had been the only person in her life who was constant, who was warm, who made her feel like she was supposed to exist in this world. 6 weeks ago, her grandmother had died suddenly, a stroke, in the kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday morning. After that, Melody had been placed with a cousin she barely knew, then moved again to a family friend, and then told, not unkindly but carelessly, the way adults sometimes deliver devastating information to children, that there was no more room, that they were sorry, that someone would figure something out. No one figured something out. So Melody had left. She had walked out one morning with nothing, because nothing was already what she had, and she had been surviving in the basement of an abandoned building 2 streets away, sleeping on cardboard, eating whatever she could find for the past 2 days. Jack listened to all of it without interrupting. His hands were flat on the table. His face was still, the way a man's face gets still when he is feeling something too large to let show all at once. When she finished, the apartment was very quiet, except for the sound of the soup beginning to bubble on the stove. "You did good, Melody," Jack said finally. "Surviving like that took courage." She looked at him like no one had ever said that to her before. Maybe no one had. He set the food in front of her and watched her eat, watched her slow herself down deliberately, the way hungry children do when they're afraid the food might disappear if they move too fast. When she'd finished, he refilled the bowl without asking. She ate that too. Later, on the couch, wrapped in a blanket with Rex pressed warm and heavy against her side, Melody fell asleep so quickly it was almost startling, the sudden, total sleep of a child who has finally, after a very long time, felt safe. Jack sat in the chair across the room and watched them both. Rex lifted his eyes to Jack once, steady and calm, and then lowered his head back onto the edge of the blanket near Melody's feet. "I've got her," those eyes said. "Rest." The weeks that followed were not simple. Jack contacted the authorities that same night, and from there began the long, complicated process of emergency foster placement, social worker visits, background checks, and paperwork that seemed designed to exhaust anyone without the particular stubbornness of a man who had once spent 4 days without sleep in a hostile environment and kept going anyway. People were skeptical. A 50-year-old single veteran with no prior parenting record, living alone in a 2-bedroom apartment, the system had questions. Jack answered every one. He attended every meeting, completed every requirement, never raised his voice, and never backed down. "SEALs don't quit," he told his caseworker once, without drama or aggression, just as a simple statement of fact. She had noted it in her file and scheduled the next visit. The nights were hard. Melody had nightmares, sudden, violent ones that pulled her out of sleep screaming. On those nights, Rex was always there first, always reached her before Jack's feet hit the floor, pressing himself close to her in the dark, absorbing her fear with his steadiness until her breathing slowed and her hands stopped shaking. Jack would sit on the edge of the couch then, and sometimes they would all 3 stay like that for a while, without speaking. A veteran, a child, and a dog who understood things that couldn't be explained in any language but presence. Melody began, slowly, to trust. She started eating without watching the plate like it might vanish. She began leaving a few bites behind, which Jack recognized as the quiet milestone it was. She asked about Rex's military service one evening, and Jack told her some of it, the parts a child could hold, and Melody listened with enormous seriousness and then patted Rex's head and said, "You're brave." Rex, for his part, accepted this as his due. And then, one evening in early February, Melody was sitting on the kitchen floor doing a puzzle while Rex dozed beside her, and Jack was washing dishes. And she said it, quietly, tentatively, like she was testing whether the word was allowed. "Dad?" Jack's hands stopped moving in the sink. "Can Rex sleep in my room tonight?" He stood there for a moment with his back to her, looking at the window above the sink, at the dark winter night outside, at his own reflection, a 50-year-old man who had survived wars and losses and years of quiet emptiness. And he felt something move in his chest that he hadn't felt in so long he'd almost forgotten what it was. He turned around. "Yeah, sweetheart," he said. "He can sleep in your room." She smiled, a real one, unguarded and bright, and went back to her puzzle. Jack turned back to the dishes, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he didn't feel alone. 6 months after Christmas Eve, in a small courtroom in rural Virginia, a judge signed the papers that made Jack Thompson the legal, permanent, forever father of a little girl named Melody. The courtroom was quiet. There were no crowds, no speeches. Just Jack in a clean button-down shirt, Melody in a yellow dress she had picked herself, and Rex sitting at Jack's left side, permitted in the room through a provision for certified service animals, which Rex technically was, and which Jack had made certain the court was aware of. When the judge said the final words and set down his pen, Melody turned and wrapped both arms around Jack's waist and held on. Jack held her back, one large hand careful and steady against her small back, and he looked up at the ceiling for a moment, the way men do when they don't want anyone to see their face. Rex sat very still and very tall beside them, like a soldier at attention, like a witness. Jack Thompson had spent his life believing that purpose was something that lived in mission, in the clarity of a target, an objective, a team depending on you. He had not known until a cold Christmas Eve in a dark alley that purpose could also look like a little girl with raw red hands reaching out to touch a dog that had already decided she was worth protecting. Melody had needed a father, Jack had needed a reason, and Rex, as he had always done, had simply led them toward each other and stayed close until they found their footing. Because that is what loyalty does. It doesn't make noise about itself. It doesn't ask for recognition. It simply shows up, in the cold, in the dark, in the hardest and most unexpected moments, and refuses to leave until the people it loves are safe. If this story reached something inside you, if it reminded you that second chances are real, that broken people can still build beautiful things, and that a dog's love is sometimes the purest and most honest love in the world, then you are exactly who Jack and Rex Tales is made for. Subscribe to Jack and Rex Tales, because every week we come back to remind you of the same truth this story told, that courage still lives in ordinary people, that kindness still changes lives, and that loyalty, real loyalty, never walks away. This story carries several layers of genuine value for its viewers. On a human level, it honestly portrays the experience of childhood grief and displacement, the reality that when a primary caregiver is lost, a child can fall through the gaps of an imperfect system quickly and quietly. It raises awareness, without sensationalism, of child homelessness and food insecurity, reminding viewers that these realities exist not in distant places, but in the towns and alleys most of us pass without looking closely. For older American viewers specifically, it reflects the lived experience of many veterans, the difficulty of returning to civilian life, the silence of isolated retirement, and the profound human need for purpose that does not disappear when a uniform comes off. It validates the idea that a person is never too old, too broken, or too alone to begin again. The story also demonstrates the documented therapeutic role of animals, particularly trained dogs, in trauma recovery, both for veterans and for children. Rex's instinctive, consistent emotional support throughout the story mirrors real research on the healing power of animal companionship in high-stress and traumatic situations. Finally, it affirms the value of chosen family, the belief that love, commitment, and loyalty are not diminished by the absence of biological connection, and that some of the strongest families are built not from shared blood, but from shared moments of courage and care.